Hello and welcome. I'm Liz, and I hope you're feeling good about building up your psych-social knowledge. In this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at theories of emotion, and specifically comparing Cannon-Bard and James Lange theories using the Cannon-Bard experiments that were actually run to develop that set of theory. So, within this lesson, you're not only going to get comfortable with these theories, you're also going to get comfortable with the biological underpinnings of why Cannon-Bard theory came to be. Let's get started. Take a few moments to read over the scenario for this lesson. The scenario describes a series of experiments being conducted to test a theory, a setup you'll often see on test day for both passages and for questions. This kind of detective approach to a question, using a hypothesis and an experiment to test a concept, is really what science is all about. So we're going to get some practice analyzing one of these experiments today. As you may have noticed, the scenario already introduced the two theories of emotion we'll be discussing: James Lange and Cannon-Bard theories. In this exercise, we're going to have the chance to retrace some of the steps of Cannon and Bard's logic as they tested and eventually challenged some of the inherent assumptions of James Lange theory. Our first prompt goes straight to the core of this experiment. In order to ultimately understand how Cannon-Bard theory functionally differs from James Lange, we must understand how it is the experiments they performed related and still relate to James Lange theory. James Lange theory holds that a precipitating event leads to a physiological response, which in turn helps to generate an emotional response. As an example, if a bear were dropped in the room you're in right now, here's how James Lange theory says you would react. You would have a physiological response, things like your heart pounding, your pupils dilating, sweating, and because of that response, your body would recognize those as the symptoms of fear and respond by having you experience those emotions. On a technical front, we can describe that response in terms of body systems. Following an event, the physiological response would be experienced, typically as peripheral innervation, prior to any sort of emotional response. This physiological response would lead to some sort of processing by portions of the body devoted to emotion generation. We know today that those would be found in brain structures like the amygdala. Emotion generation would occur in those brain regions, and that would create the emotional response, which would have to occur after the physiological response. In this scenario, we were told that the sympathetic structures were completely removed. No physiological response is possible. Essentially, any input to the brain from the extremities was quite literally cut out. There was no ability for a physiological response to occur. After chopping out those peripheral inputs, Cannon and Bard tested to see if the model animal could still experience an emotional response. And they could. What does this mean for James Lange theory? If this is true, the central assumption of James Lange theory cannot be true. Physiological response can't be said to be required for an emotional response. The event itself was all that was required to generate an emotional response in the Cannon-Bard experiments. Going back to our previous example with the bear, you wouldn't need to feel the pounding heart and the cold sweat to know you should be afraid and surprised, according to these experimental findings. Now that we've taken a look at why Cannon-Bard theory would remove physiological response as a required, necessary precursor to emotional response, we have to consider why they would want to include physiology in their model at all. As we saw in the original scenario, there were two different sets of experiments run by Cannon and Bard. In the early experiments, which we just reviewed, the peripheral nervous system was completely removed from animals. In other words, they just didn't have a PNS to generate responses. The viscera were completely cut out. Later on, realizing the PNS may still be important, they ran new experiments that detached the PNS from the CNS, but didn't remove the PNS entirely. The viscera were cut off from sending signals to the brain, but not removed. Again, these animals in later experiments had viscera that were functioning and could receive signals from the brain, but couldn't send signals to the brain. And we're told in the scenario that these animals in the later experiments did have a physiological response, racing heart symptoms and so on, when put in stressful situations. But the brain wouldn't know that these responses were occurring. In later experiments, what was seen in the PNS as a result of the emotion-generating event, and how does that PNS response affect Cannon-Bard theory? Well, the physiological response still occurred. In other words, an event that will lead to an emotional response will generate a physiological response provided that the animal has a functional peripheral nervous system. The physiological response is, according to these experiments, apparently just totally independent of the emotional response. but it does still occur with the emotional response. If a bear gets dropped in the room with you, you may not need to feel those racing heart symptoms to feel fear, but I can promise you, you will always feel that racing heart in response to a sudden threat. So the physiological response can't be just disregarded. If an event generates an emotion, it's generating a physiological response too. That's why Cannon and Bard would want to continue to consider the role of physiology in emotion theory. To sum up the conclusion of this experiment, we're going to do exactly what Cannon and Bard did, adjust James Lange theory. Both theories should still start with the emotion-generating event. What should Cannon-Bard theory do differently? Cannon and Bard found that both physiology and emotion happened, but they didn't really rely on each other, meaning the event leads to two separate, simultaneous responses, the emotional response and the physiological response. In total, their theory still contains all three components of James Lange theory, but the relationships between those different parts have changed. Instead of a first and second response to an event, there's now just one response, the generation of emotion and physiology at the same time as separate occurrences. We explored the relationship between James Lange and Cannon-Bard theory. After watching this video, you should feel a little bit more comfortable with those two theories, as well as their biological underpinnings. And in the future, you're going to be able to apply those theories to a brand new scenario or situation. Make sure to practice comparing and contrasting these theories and applying them to brand new situations before test day.